Hi, everyone. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 group. I'm just going to let everybody in who's still in the waiting room. Let me see if I can change that setting. Okay, so welcome. Nice to see everybody tonight. As you can see, we've got a lot of people on this Zoom, and let me just give you some housekeeping rules before we get started. One is I like to run these actually as meetings, just because it's just nice to see people's faces if they're willing to be on video. And so it's nice to see everybody who has their video on. And if you don't, that's fine too, but you have the option. And you've come in muted. Everybody, we prefer if you can stay muted, but if this at some point you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's fine too. This is interactive. So if, sometimes you can just explain yourself better verbally, that's perfectly fine. You don't have to put everything in chat, but we do have the chat. I'll be looking at the questions in there as well. And this is recorded. If for some reason you have to leave early tomorrow, we'll send a link with the recording. If you want to watch it again or share it with somebody else, you'll have that link. And I think that's all my little housekeeping for now. And we'll get started. Tonight, we're going to talk about what the results of this past admission season. I'm kind of shaking my head because it was a crazy one. I can't say it's completely shaken out yet, but I think, at least a fair amount of it, we can start to make sense of. Things are probably still gonna happen over the next few weeks, but we have enough data to start to look at now and interpret and hopefully give you insights as to, what you should take away for your students next year. And the reality is that things are constantly changing, so this is absolutely a crazy year. And I think next year might be a little calmer, but it's probably going to have some ups and downs too that we can't even anticipate yet. We'll try and be on top of it and help you, but just want to say that because we can't predict with 100% certainty how the year is going to go, but hopefully we will at least be a little step ahead so that you don't feel like you're behind in knowing what to do. So tonight I'm here with Rebecca Chabro, who is the head of college counseling at Linden Hall Girls School and is also we're calling you Rebecca. We made a new title for you, or the counselor in residence.
Oh, sounds great.
She's the counselor in residence in our concierge service, which we'll talk to you a little bit about. And so we always do a lot of these free Zooms and Facebook Lives, but also wanted to tell you that the session that we're doing tonight is really just a sample of the type of stuff that we do on a monthly basis with people who are in what we call this concierge service, which we'll talk to you a little bit more about later if you're interested. And I have to say, it's kind of a funny thing. It's kind of like a round circle, because tonight I ended the concierge service for my class of 2021 families. So it was kind of a nice ending, and they actually at the end they said, oh, can we still get together? They want to get together after everybody's been moved in, and they still want to kind of touch base and talk with each other. So anyhow, I'm going to pass it off to Rebecca, and she's going to go through all the numbers that we've pulled together, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can.
All right, thank you. So,
sorry, Rebecca, one last thing. For anybody, however you want to view this, obviously Rebecca's sharing. You can actually, on the top right, if you wanted to, you can just do speaker view if you just want to see Rebecca's face, or if you want to see gallery, that's up to you.
If you see my face, you'll see my beautiful school in the background. But I think you're going to want to look at the PowerPoint because I have a lot of numbers and data on there, and a good presenter typically doesn't read the entire slide. So I will be kind of reading some of the things, but not all of it. So if you want all the data points, you definitely want to look at the slides. But as Debbie, you could see my slide, right? All right.
Yes.
Correct? Yes,
Yes.
great. So as Debbie said, my name is Rebecca Chabro. I'm the Director of College Counseling at Linden Hall, which is the oldest all-girls boarding school in the country. We're located in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, but I've worked in public schools. I've worked in international schools, religious schools. I've worked in pretty much every setting that you can think of. So I've worked with lots of different populations, all different races, socioeconomics, demographics, religion. So I have a good idea of the college admissions landscape. All right. So this year, well, actually, let me just move to my next slide. Hold on. All right. So as she said, did you want to just, Debbie?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't really yeah. So I mentioned, and again, we'll kind of mention this again at the end. If anybody is interested in the concierge service, we only open it up a few times a year. And quite honestly, we're opening it up for the next few weeks from now until June 2nd. And then that is it for the class of 2022. Like, this is the last time that we're going to let class of 2022 families in. So if you have any interest, you should consider it now as a little bit of a push too. If you sign up by the 23rd, you're going to get a free copy of Ron Lieber's book, The Price You Pay for College, which is an excellent book about navigating the paying for college process. And we will, this is not good, but you can't, it says to click to join. It's actually roadtocollege.com/concierge. I'll put it in the chat, but anyhow, that's just a little like bonus. If you want to sign up early, do it by the 23rd, you'll get the book and you will get invited to a Q&A, a private Q&A with Ron. So that's our little plug.
And just about the concierge service, I've been doing monthly workshops since January with the class of 2022, and I will be doing kind of a catch-up session for everybody who joins. Obviously, I won't be able to go into as much detail as my, I guess, 5 monthly workshops I've done so far. I'm not going to give 5 hours worth of information in about an hour.
People will have access. They'll have access. You will have access.
Great. So they'll have access to my past workshops, which cover basically everything you should be doing in junior year to get ready, but also helps give you insight for senior year as well. So you'll get that, and I'll continue to do workshops throughout the summer and fall. So great. All right, so just a little bit of headlines of what we will be talking about tonight, but then I'll go into obviously more detail. This was the year of test optional this past year, and I'll go into why, and then how did that impact application numbers? They reached an all-time high at many universities. Then ultimately, what were the outcomes of this crazy year in college admissions? And then how does that impacted the waiting list? And then finally, what stays and what goes? So, what's going to be the same from this crazy year? What's going to go back to normal? What might be in between? Okay, so this year, a lot of colleges went test optional. One of the big things, obviously, with COVID, test centers were closed. The few test centers were open, had very limited seats because they had to have their seats spread further apart. Test centers were canceled. I had so many students have tests scheduled and then canceled, and it was just a mess. And so a lot of colleges went test optional. We had a lot that were test, it's a movement that's been growing in college admissions. It's something that you may think college admissions is all about standardized tests. Most people in college admissions want standardized tests to go away. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily their choice, but more their administration's choice. But there is a growing trend towards test optional. This definitely pushed that further. And so this year, there was over 500 colleges went test optional. Over half, like I said, half were test optional beforehand, and another 30% transitioned to test optional after. Most of the major colleges across the country that people know of went test optional. The big exception was the Florida State universities. All of the public schools in Florida did not they did not go test optionals. Those were the big name ones that didn't. And you can see that the numbers reflected that. So, with the Common App last year, 77% of applications were submitted with a test score. And this year, only 46% were submitted with a test score. ACT said they saw a 20 to 30% decrease in the students sending test scores. So there definitely was an impact. As of the past month or so, the last time they updated it, 1,400 colleges, that's about 60% of the four-year institutions, have already announced that they will not require SATs for the fall. Although some are, going back. I know Debbie and I were just talking before this, how the Georgia Public University System just announced that they will be going back to standardized testing. So, some are saying, but what the ACT says is, as has always been the case, schools that tend to experiment with test optional admissions almost always keep the policies in place. So I would say, moving forward, it looks like there probably more schools will be test optional than were before. A few will go back, but I think a lot will stay. But I've been seeing a number of schools, most schools I've talked to, because I meet with colleges all the time. We have high school visits where the colleges do virtual visits, and I'm talking to them, and pretty much every single one I've talked to has said we're staying test optional for next year, and they're really excited about it. All of the colleges were like the admissions officers really liked being test optional because it allowed them to look at more students. All right, so obviously test optional, then more, the test score isn't prohibiting certain people from applying, so application numbers went up. Also uncertainty there was a lot of uncertainty this year, so it was kind of a vicious cycle where there was uncertainty, so then they applied to more schools, and then as more people were applying to more schools, there was more uncertainty, and so then people apply to even more schools. So overall, there was an 11% increase in applications, but really only a 1% increase in applicants. So that means that people were really just applying to more schools. And I can tell you, as a school-based counselor, I saw that in my students' lists. They were much larger than they had been in previous years. As much as I say you only need, no more than 12 schools is really like the maximum I say that a student should be applying to. I definitely had probably over half my students apply to over 12 schools, and it was a lot of work. But that's not in every population. So there was a 1.6% decrease in first generation applicants. So that's students whose parents hadn't gone to college before. And this is, really in large part because the people who were most impacted by COVID were those lower income families, generally families who hadn't gone to college. Also, unfortunately, Black and Latino families that were disproportionately affected by COVID. If you couldn't keep your job and your finances the same as they had been previously, then people were worried about being able to go away to college. And so that did decrease that. But like I said, the amount of applications that people who actually were applying to college did increase. So there's a 9% increase to 5.8 applications per applicant, and that's on average. But like I said, from what I saw, it was much higher, but I also do work at a private school, so I will acknowledge that. There was a 13% increase in international students, although a decrease of students from China, not really a big surprise. And then they were definitely going more towards those larger, more selective private schools. And more selective schools in general got more applications because these were schools that used to have that barrier of a test score that people would say, okay, I'm not going to apply because they're looking for a 1,500 or a 1,400 plus. But now if they don't have that number, a lot of students thought they were admissible, whether they were or not. Some were, some weren't. But without that barrier of test scores, they felt like they were more admissible. And so they got a lot more applications. So this is kind of how the breakdown of which kind of colleges got more. So the private, large, more selective colleges got, for the most part, the biggest increase in applications. So those private, large, more selective universities saw a 20.66% increase in applications overall. The public, large, more selective universities, so like the UC schools, UNC, University of Virginia, they saw overall a 15.53% increase. And then after that, the private, small, more selective schools, those small liberal arts colleges, 14.11% increase. And then those large public, less selective schools, but still big names like University of Alabama, those Arizona State, those types of schools where they have big names, but they're not necessarily the most selective, that kind of category, because they have those names, also were getting more applicants. the schools that didn't get as many. So the private, large, less selective schools and the private, small, less selective schools. You could see, oh, you know what? I think I put in the wrong number for one of them, but it was also a small number because it's not the same number. So my apologies there. I'll get an update on the accurate number, but it was something small, like it was a small percentage increase, which is actually really a shame because those private schools that are less selective are the ones that are going to give away a lot more merit money. So it's actually a shame that they saw a much smaller increase in applications than the other schools because people don't realize that they're the ones that they would actually get money from. And then the public small, more selective colleges and the public small, less selective. Sorry, once again, I messed that type up. But those were they were not, they actually had a decrease in applications this year. And then that really shows here, I have some actual case data. So,
Rebecca, sorry. Oh, okay. You're gonna, somebody just asked if you could give any examples of school
right
names.
Here.
Yeah, so
right
you have
here.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the overall, but here, this kind of shows that play out. So with the University of California system, they saw a 16.1% increase overall. UCLA saw the most. They saw a 28% increase in applications overall. And then UC Irvine, they saw a 47% increase in first generation applicants, which is really amazing. Now the UC schools were test blind this year, so they did not consider test scores, and that's actually something that's going to stay. There was just a case that a ruling that came out that they're actually going to stay test blind and not consider. So it's beyond test optional. Test optional is you can choose whether or not to accept it. Test blind means they don't consider them at all. So even if you wanted to send them, they will not look at them. So that obviously really helps students who are from low income, first generation, underrepresented populations. And so UC Irvine saw a 47% increase in, or no, sorry, not increase, 47% of their applicants were first generation. So it's a huge population is applying there. 48% increase of Black applicants at UCLA and UC Berkeley, 33% increase of Latinx applicants at UCLA and a 36% increase at Berkeley. And then UCLA saw a 16% increase in American Indian applicants, which is really great. So you can see a lot more applicants going to these big name schools. Now in California, the Cal State system's not as big name of a school, not as highly selective. And overall as a system, they went down 5% in applications. And to California Polytech Pomona, which is there's two Cal Poly campuses. San Luis Obispo is the more popular one, the more selective one. But you can see Pomona, they actually had a 40% decrease in applications. Another thing, just so the SUNY system, that's a really good case study here because the State University of New York system has 4 flagship universities. It has Binghamton, Buffalo, Albany, and Stony Brook. And as the data here I have, you can see Binghamton did have a little bit of an increase. They are, moderately selective school for, in upstate New York, but the rest of the schools within the state university system, other than those 4, are smaller colleges. And so those are those smaller publics. And as you can see, overall, 14% decrease in applications from the SUNY system. Portland State in Oregon, it's a public school in Oregon, they went down 12%. Loyola University in Maryland went down 10%. And that's a private school in Maryland. And that's another thing to mention, that there was a correlation with location. So the biggest increase in applications was within the Southwestern colleges, and the biggest and the smallest increase in applications was within the Mid-Atlantic colleges. And that really kind of makes sense because Mid-Atlantic colleges tend to be smaller. So you have a lot of smaller colleges in the Mid-Atlantic, and you have a lot of small, not as selective colleges. And then in those Southwestern states, it's more spread out, and they have less colleges, but they're bigger, and they have those bigger names, the big sports programs that attract a lot of people and a lot of interest. And so that kind of has that correlation to size and selectivity as well, along with the location. So overall change in location. Now there are going to be a few slides
Rebecca,
here.
sorry, can I ask maybe you can just give a general definition. Somebody asked, what would you define as selective?
Selective. So for these purposes, I think it was less than, so when I'm saying selective here, they were saying less than 50%.
50% admission rate.
Yeah. So so less than 50% is, I think, what Common App defined selective or not selective, or not as selective.
Okay,
So
just,
for the,
yeah, just so people
yes.
can have a frame of
Yeah.
reference.
So now what we're going to be looking at in this slide and in a few other slides, and I wish there was more data out there. I pull as much data as I can, and I'll point out where their colleges are not very transparent in certain areas, but the data that I pulled were calculations based off of data from last year and this year. And unfortunately, it's the more highly selective schools are the ones where the data is more readily available, and especially for this year. So I wasn't able to pull data I just couldn't access data for less selective schools because they just don't publish it like the more highly selective schools do. So this will be more geared towards the more highly selective schools simply for that reason. So of the schools that I had the data for, you could see this is the change in applications. So there's 20 schools that I have on this little chart that I made, this little graph, and all of them went test optional for the first time. So you can see, and I basically just took the schools that had over a 20, I couldn't fit any more on this page, but 25% or more increase in applications. So all of them went test optional for the first time. All 8 Ivy League colleges are included in this. So all 8 Ivy League colleges were above 25% increase. And one thing I thought that was interesting was that 13 of these, because there were more colleges that I had data for, but these were the ones that had the biggest increase. 13 of them were near substantial sized cities, which I thought was also kind of interesting that, you had that draw. But then you have Colgate, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere, that had 104% increase. It was insane. So they just had a lot of applications. But highly selective colleges overall had a 17%. So these are mostly highly selective colleges, but they overall for highly selective colleges had 17% increase in applications. So test optional results. Now, what I'm going to preface this with saying is that very few colleges gave enough data for me to figure out this information. Colleges are not being transparent with their test optional results. So University of Pennsylvania, actually, I had one of their reps, because I posted in my college admissions counselor's Facebook group to say, are there any other colleges with more information? And I got a few more for the next slide. But University of Pennsylvania actually posted their statistics, but it didn't have enough data. They basically had like the percentage of students that were admitted without test scores, but didn't have enough information for me to figure out what the percentage of students admitted without test scores were. So for the total, so it was hard for me to figure that out. Colleges are not being very transparent, but for the early decision round for University of Pennsylvania, they were a little bit more transparent. They had a 23% increase in apps. Their overall acceptance rate for early decision was 15%, but it was 18% for students with test scores, 9% for those without test scores. Georgetown didn't provide all their information for early action, but you can see that there. Emory University, I have the information for Emory, Colgate, Georgia Tech, and Vanderbilt. And as you can see, it varies, but for the most part, the acceptance rate was significantly, other than Vanderbilt, where it was only a 1% difference. It was still significantly higher, the acceptance rate for students who submitted test scores than without. And basically my theory for this, based off of my experience as a college counselor, is, well, there's 2 options. One, it could be the colleges are less test optional than they say they are, and they really do prioritize tests. But I also think part of the factor is that from what I've seen as a counselor over the past decade that I've been working as a college counselor, generally, and this isn't everybody, but for the most part, top students who are admissible to these schools are also top test takers. And students that are not good test takers, for the most part, not always, are generally not admissible to these schools anyway. These schools are very, very, very hard to get into. And so it's, I think going test optional gave a lot of students a false sense of admissibility. And so you'll see as a result, a lot of acceptance rates went down, and we'll see that momentarily. But first, some schools that were actually a little bit closer. And with many things in college admissions, it depends, because you could see that previous slide, there was a pretty drastic difference, although Vanderbilt was only 1% difference between students accepted with test scores or without test scores. Boston University and Northeastern University both had 18% tests acceptance rates for students with test scores or without test scores. Tufts did have a difference of about 4%, 4.5%. But you see, one thing that these three schools did report was not only the percentage of students that the acceptance rate for students with test scores or without, but they also show the percentage of students that applied test optional, which was interesting to see as well. So Tufts and Northeastern, 50% of their applicants applied test optional. Boston was 41%. So those were just some interesting statistics to see. University of San Francisco responded to my Facebook request as well for more data. And they said that 75% of their admitted students applied test optional. So that means the majority of the students they admitted applied test optional. And University of San Francisco is a school that is not as highly selective. And so you'll see, for the most part, a lot of these things where they really, like we're talking about the highly selective schools, because at the less highly selective schools, generally, if you would get accepted, the test optional, you probably have a better chance of getting accepted anyway, whether you apply test optional or not. They're just not as highly selective, but these highly selective schools is where these numbers tend to matter. Okay. So changes in admit rates. So like I said, once again, the numbers I tend to have are for the more highly selective schools, because that's just the numbers that tend to be reported. So you can see here, I know everyone always wants to know about the Ivies, so I did include them separately, and then I did some small liberal arts colleges. But you can see the change in acceptance rates, and it generally, for the most part, although not entirely, correlated to the difference in admission, so the difference in applications and the difference in acceptance rate. So in all of these cases, all of them went up. The number of applications went up pretty dramatically. But you can see that, you know, for the most part, for the Ivy League schools, they tended to, the acceptance rate went down, 1.5 to 3%, 3% or so. And then on the small liberal arts colleges, it's a little bit more dramatic. So Colgate, once again, had that huge increase in applications. And so obviously their acceptance rate went down a lot, because they had an enormous amount of applications that they did not have space for, because they're still the same
Rebecca, any insights? I can't personally say that I know, like, why Colgate in particular had such a spike.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
It blows my mind, because it's not like it's in a desirable location. But I think one thing that's interesting to look at these numbers of all these schools that are listed here is that Colby, they're at the bottom. Colby is the only school of these schools that was test optional prior. So you can see how a school that was already test optional, they didn't get an increase in applications, but they got the smallest increase of applications out of any of these schools listed here. And they probably got an increase of applications simply because people were just applying to more schools out of the uncertainty. But it wasn't as drastic because they had already been test optional. And as a result, they had less of a difference in their acceptance rate. So test optional did definitely play a factor, but it was simply because more people were applying, but definitely led to a decrease in acceptance rates as a result, because these colleges, other than Rice did increase they are increasing their size, their enrollment by 20% this year. So they were able to accept more students, but for the most part, colleges are staying the same size, which there are articles about how they call the highly rejective schools should be making themselves bigger to accommodate more applicants, but that's just not happening. Look up that article though, it's an interesting article. So overall, there was a lower acceptance rate, but some schools, there were actually more students accepted. So because there were so many more students that applied, you could have it still accept more students, but have overall a lower acceptance rate. So what I found interesting, you could see the students that were able to accept, under 100 more, but still tended to be some of the smaller schools, smaller colleges. but then you did see as it got, then 100 to 900 or 100 to 1,000 more accepted, you could see a number of these schools. For the most part, they tend to be a little bit bigger than those schools that were only able to accept more, which makes sense. They're bigger. They tend to have a little bit more space. And like I said, Rice is one of the smaller ones here, but Rice did increase their enrollment by 20% this year. And then, as you can see, the schools that were able to still accept 1,000 more, they're all large universities. So they did have the capacity to be able to take a few more students this year. But overall, still, each one of these schools, their acceptance rates went down. And then, but for the most part, there were actually more schools that not only did their acceptance rate go down, but they actually accepted fewer students this year. And there are many reasons for that, but one big reason is gap year students. So this is last year. So a lot of students, graduated from high school 2020, and we're going to be freshmen in college this year. And they're like, well, we had a horrible ending to high school, and we don't want to miss out on a first year of college because of COVID and have to study at home. So we're just going to take a gap year. And there were gap years like we haven't seen. And so it was interesting because the quotes that I have listed here, so this data, everything like that, this is all stuff that I pulled before we got the admissions results, and the colleges were saying different things. So, but as you can see, Dartmouth had they had 5 times as many students taking a gap year this past school year as they typically do. Yale had 7 times the amount, Penn had 4 times the amount, but they were all saying different things. So Dartmouth was saying it's too soon to assess how this is going to impact things. And in the end, they ended up accepting 132 fewer applicants than they had in previous years. And you can see that difference is almost what it would be, is almost the difference in how many students took gap years, how many more students took gap years than typically. For Yale, they said the admissions office has no plans to reduce the number of admissions offers for this upcoming year, yet they took 135 fewer applicants this year. So clearly they were wrong, because I'm sorry, I don't understand how they could say we have 7 times the students taking a gap year than normal, but still, so we're going to have, almost 300 more students coming in from a previous year, and yet they still were going to keep the same enrollment numbers. So they did end up accepting fewer, although their freshman class will still be larger than normal because they have more students coming in from that gap year. Penn did say that's 150 more seats that will be filled than during a typical year when speaking to their increase of students for gap years. And in the end, they did accept 200 fewer applicants. So that is something that did impact students this year. I don't see it being as big of a problem next year, because I think people want to just get back to normal. And so, I think especially as, people are getting vaccinated and they can have more of that normal college experience, they're going to want that. So I don't see students taking gap years this upcoming year like they did last year. And I'll tell you, the only students I've heard from my senior class wanting to take gap years, one is she's in the Army Reserves, and she has to do a training that is preventing her from starting in the fall, and her school won't let her. She's going to Princeton, and her school won't let her start in the spring. So she's going to just defer for a year with Princeton. And then my other student she's applying for a gap year now because she got accepted to a special language immersion program where she's going to be learning Russian, but that's not typical. So they have very specific reasons. Other than that, I'm not hearing about any students wanting to take gap years. So another way some population that this did impact, so there was lower acceptance rates, but a population that was really impacted in a positive way were underserved populations. So the New York Times said that first generation, lower income, as well as Black, Hispanic, and Native American students were much less likely than others to submit their test scores on applications. And as a result, you can see that they fared much better in the application process than they typically have. So you could see at Harvard, 18% of admitted students were Black, up from 14.8% last year. And you can see the Latinx numbers also went up. And for the first time, Harvard accepted more than 20% of their class were Pell Grant eligible, meaning that they're like low income students. And so you can see at these other schools across the board and lots of different types. So you've got Harvard, which is Ivy League. You have a very large public university in New York and University of Southern California. You have small liberal arts college, Washington and Lee. Drexel is not as quite as competitive, but Urban University in Philadelphia. All these populations were benefited this year through the test optional process. And you can see really it was in large part to test optional because University of Florida was not test optional and they didn't give data. But well, they did give a little bit of data later on in their article, but they stated while the number of UF admits keeps growing, Black, Hispanic, and Native American admits subtly decreased this year. So they did have less applicants in those areas, and thus didn't accept as many as well. So test optional policies do help those underserved populations. So then you have the wait list. So the wait list has been very big this year because obviously with all the uncertainty of college applications, so colleges are accepting students, but they also, because students are applying to so many more schools, they don't know, it's hard for them to judge whether the students will actually enroll. So I have like BC before COVID era and CE COVID era. So before COVID era, the wait list was used to fill spots when too many accepted applicants go elsewhere, which is a big concern this year for COVID as well. But it also helps control the yield by requiring additional demonstrated interest. So yield is the percentage of students who are accepted at a school who decide to enroll. So what this does is some colleges will not accept a full class. They'll waitlist students, and then they'll ask them to demonstrate interest by submitting an additional essay or something like that. And then if they submit that essay, then they'll like accept them because they want to see that the student really does want to go to them, because ultimately they want the percentage of students they accept to be that enroll to be higher. And I had a student that happened to. I had a student that applied to Grinnell, got waitlisted, and basically wrote her essay, sent it in, and got admitted pretty much right away. So that was something that was kind of interesting. Colleges will also use their waitlist to kind of give a soft deny to students that they don't want to hurt their feelings, but for certain reasons. So like legacies, they might want money out of their family in the future, so they might not want to, things like that. Also to maintain relations with high schools. So sometimes they'll say, they'll waitlist a valedictorian or salutatorian because they don't want the high school to think that they can't get anybody in the future. So it's like, okay, if your top student doesn't get in, is anyone ever going to get in? They want you to still send them applicants. And hold on. Sorry, needed a sip of water. Also, waitlists are not ranked generally. So it's not like there's you're number one on the waiting list. Generally, if they get a bunch, let's say they accept a lot of people from a certain area, a certain state, and no one from that state or very few people from that state decide to come, maybe they'll look in that state to take somebody off the waiting list. So it's whatever fulfills needs that they're not getting through the people that they've accepted. But now in COVID era, oh, somebody drawing on my screen. That's strange. Anyway, in COVID era, wait lists have dramatically increased because there is so much yield uncertainty. And so I've seen way more students get put on wait lists this year than in previous years. And some schools in previous years, they would take a number of students off their wait list. Some schools wouldn't take any students off their wait list. So it varies. And right now schools are still doing it. Still working on their wait lists, still taking students off their wait lists, and things are going to wait lists are going to continue going throughout the summer. Although I did see some schools, I believe Carnegie Mellon closed their wait list recently. So some schools are done. They filled their class. They've gotten their deposits. They've gotten enough students, but not all have. And then in 2020, many more students were accepted off the wait list than previous years. So it's not, I wouldn't say that looking at last year's numbers would be the best indicator for the future, just because with so many students wanting to take gap years, a lot of colleges went to their wait lists when they wouldn't have before. So that's just something to keep in mind. But then this is just some wait list information. So students who, just so you can kind of understand that generally, wait lists, you shouldn't hold your breath if you get accepted off of the wait list, because most often you're most likely not going to get in. There's a lot of schools will put more students on the wait list than they will have accepted students. So they'll have more students on the wait list than accepted students, which means they have enough students that if every student that they accept says, I don't want to go to your school, they'll have enough students on their wait list to accept a whole nother class. And students generally, when they get accepted off a wait list, have more desire to go to the school because they were at first they were rejected. So now it's become more of a prize to get in. But as you can see here, this is a good example of, this is the class of 2023. So this is 2 senior classes ago. So a pre-COVID year, but you can see the number of students who accepted waitlist offers at each of these schools, and then the number of students who were taken from the waitlist. So as you can see, in all the cases, very small. University of Miami took the most students from their waitlist, but still not a lot. This year, the arts and science group found that 20% of students are on waiting lists this year. And the numbers vary, but the waiting lists tend to have more minority students than white students. But they do also tend to have more higher income students than lower income students. So it seems like they're trying to diversify their schools. So they want to definitely keep those minorities on in case the minorities decide to go elsewhere. But they also want students who will be able to pay for the school, so that higher income students are hopefully going to be able to pay more. About 40% of students said that they would attend, in the survey, 40% of students waitlisted said they would attend the college that waitlisted them over their current first choice school. So it does become a desirable option, but like I said, not something that you should really count on ever. So what stays, what goes? I've kind of discussed some of this stuff already, but test optional, I think, is going to stay. Not for everyone. Obviously, Georgia has gone back, but for the most part, almost every school I've talked to is going to continue to be test optional, at least for this next cycle, likely for class of 2023 as well. It depends. And then we'll see. Some are doing 2-year pilots, some are doing 3-year pilots. There's definitely a move towards test blind, which I said is taking away test scores entirely from the process. So even if you want to submit them, you can't. So I know like the UC schools and Reed College up in Portland, Oregon, they're test blind. But so that is something that I think is the biggest thing that is definitely going to stay as a trend. What's going to go, I think that, like I said, the gap years influencing admission statistics, I think those really did, because you saw a lot of schools really, they took less students this year. Not only did their acceptance rates go down, but they took less students, and that's because they had so many students coming in from last year, but that's not going to be as bad. So your students are going to be much better off than the seniors this year were. The seniors this year, I think, were really in the worst situation possible for admissions. But a lot of it is we're going to have to wait and see. So I don't think the application numbers hopefully will be as bad, I think, for my sake and for the students' sake really too, because the more applications they submit, the more essays they have to write. And it's just more work they have to do. And for the parents, it's more application fees that you have to pay for. So hopefully that won't be as big as it has been in previous years. I don't think the wait list will be as big, just because I think there'll be a little bit more certainty moving forward. And then I think that there will be lower acceptance rates, I think, than pre-pandemic, but maybe not as low as this year, because we did have quite a drastic drop in application or in acceptance rates. So I think that might change. But like I said, those things are really to be determined. I'd say the things that are more definite are the test optional and the gap year. So just to summarize, test optional has made college more accessible for underrepresented populations, but it has given a false sense of admissibility to a lot of students, which has resulted in an increase of applications. And not all colleges may be as test optional as they say they are. So, some were, Northeastern, Vanderbilt, Boston University, really, truly test optional. The University of San Francisco, really, truly test optional. But all those other schools, you got to question, are they truly test optional? And, their applicants really just, were not the the test scores correlate with the strength of the student, or were they maybe still biased and still liked looking at those test scores because those test scores prove something to them. But once again, we don't have enough data to really see, and we aren't in their admissions offices, so it's hard to tell in that sense as well, nor would they really admit if they were or not. And then results at top tier colleges indicated test optional helped a few, but not most. So like I said, at some schools, they did actually accept more students, but especially in the early decision rounds. So when I did this workshop, I did another workshop similar to this right after early decision, and there were far more schools where the acceptance rate went down, but they admitted more. So that was another trend I didn't bring up here, but in early decision, those schools tended to accept more students than previous years. And that was because there was such uncertainty in college admissions. Early decision is a binding application. And so that was a way to solidify their yield. Gap years impacted impacted some colleges, and therefore made less spots for the class as a whole. And wait lists were larger this year as well. And then finally, we will likely have a new normal in college admissions, but it's going to be somewhere that's a hybrid between before COVID era and COVID era. So Debbie, I will hand it over to you, although, oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Before we talk about this,
Yes.
there's some questions.
Okay, great.
That I think are worthwhile to ask.
Okay.
Well, one actually isn't necessarily related to what you're talking about, but I think it's a good one. And maybe just somebody's kind of asking, I know if my student applies early decision, like above everything that you talked about, there's some schools, if you looked at the numbers, there is an advantage to applying early decision.
Absolutely.
So somebody is saying, I might potentially want to apply early decision, although it's not my number one school. And because the number one school they want to go to doesn't offer early decision. So can I apply early decision? And then if I get into that other school that I'm more interested in, can I back out?
No. I would say, no, you should. I mean, you're signing a contract saying that you will go. Now, are they going to like sue you by law? No, but that being said, these colleges do have like a kind of a code of respect. And if the college that you are accepted to finds out that you withdrew from an early decision contract, then they will likely withdraw your acceptance if you are accepted. So
right.
It's not a good look. It's not good. It's not going to be good for you if anyone finds out, and you don't know who knows who, but college admissions officers know each other. And so it's not, you cannot do it. Basically, is the answer is no, you should not do it. You cannot do it. So if you apply early decision somewhere, you should be the only reason you would not go to an early decision school is if they really truly do not give you enough money for you to be able to afford it.
Right. Which I will say, and this is my personal opinion, for those schools that are early decision, they actually usually have pretty good net price calculators. And so you should be doing a net price calculator if your student's going to apply early decision someplace, and it's going to be very close to what they're going to offer. And for some reason, if it's off, in that case, you can go back and ask, but I kind of agree. I guess what I'm saying is, if your student's applying early decision, they should be committed. And if they get in, they're going to go. And even this idea of not being offered enough money, you should actually know with close to good, significance, how much you're going to have to pay before you even apply, your student applies to those schools.
Yeah. And then one other thing, kind of a do unto others as you'd want done to you. If, for example, let's say you did withdraw from the early decision school and somehow got away with it and your new school didn't find out, that early decision school would still, they would know that somebody from your high school kind of broke that contract, and they might be less likely to accept somebody from your high school in the future because maybe their counselors aren't taking early decision as seriously. And so you don't want to obviously impact other people's chances in the future because you decided to do that.
And the last thing I'll say, and again, these aren't like laws or anything like that, but a school, an individual high school could have a policy that says if that's the case, and I have heard this in individual situations, then they sometimes refuse to send the transcript to
Yeah.
the new school. So
And we absolutely can do that. Like if, like I know at my school, if somebody hasn't paid their bill fully, we can not send their transcript. So we can absolutely say like, we will not send your transcript if you do that. And then they will not enroll you if they don't have a final transcript. So yeah, don't do that. It's just not, it's not okay.
So Rebecca, there was a question, I'm kind of
Mhm.
scrolling back here. What's the ideal number of colleges to apply to, given all the volatility, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like, so
Mhm.
pre-COVID, you're a BCE, which I love that.
Yeah. I was thinking, I was like, oh, that's actually kind of clever.
In BCE times, you might have recommended like a certain number of schools to apply to,
Yeah.
but the reality is there is just more volatility in the
Yeah.
system. So like, given that, do you still stick to what you used to recommend, or
I
do
mean,
you recommend?
I used to recommend 6 to 10. So now I recommend like 8 to 12. But I think if you're really doing your research, you should have a well-balanced list. And so for the most part, unless you're applying to the top like 50 schools or so, it's actually a lot more predictable than you think. And there's far more colleges in the US that will accept you and also that will give you money, and good amount of money. Um, than you think. And so, as long as you have a well balanced list, you don't need to apply to more because you'll have those likely options. You'll have those target options that you should be able to get into that you don't need to. I mean, I always say if you have at least 2 likely schools that you're willing to go to, like then you can have the rest. I mean, if you're happy, like I have one student who her second choice school is essentially Auburn, which is not very highly selective. And so I'm like, great, apply wherever you want because I'm positive she can get into Auburn. And so then, it's a school that she really likes and she knows she can afford. So great. I'm fine if she applies to all other reach schools. And so she can apply to,
Because she has a good fallback.
because she has a good fallback. So as long as you have a school, I like to say 2, so you can have a choice. As long as you have 2 likely options that you're happy going to, then you can have more reach schools and not have it be as balanced if you're fine only having 2 choices. Now, I had a student who applied to only 2 likely schools and then the rest were like Ivy level schools and then didn't get into those and then was really upset that she only had 2 options. But that, you need to be honest with yourself. Is that going to be okay? But I always say, let's say you do have 12 schools, right? Then you can have 4 likely schools, 4 target schools, and 4 reach schools. And honestly, target schools are still pretty likely generally. I mean, for the most part, target schools are schools that I'd say you don't guarantee that you'd be accepted to, but you do still have a good shot of getting accepted because you're within their typically accepted range. And so generally, if you have 4, 4, and 4, that equals 12, then that's really 8 schools that you should be able to get into. There's really no need to have more.
And I will tell you also from experience and from the parents families that are in the concierge service and from, Rebecca's years of experience, if you do the research and you create a balanced list, your student will get into several of the schools on that list if you know what you're doing. And I don't mean to say that I guess what I'm saying is it's actually not that hard to know what you're doing, as long as you kind of, put a little effort into understanding the process, which is part of why people are here tonight. And you do the research and understand, which schools are going to give your student money, which schools are not going to give your student money, what the stats are that you might need to get that money. Do they have the majors and that type of thing that your student is interested in? So my point is, if you build the list well, you should have a significant number of schools that your student got into and also got money from.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a question here, Rebecca, and I don't know if we can answer this, but just somebody's asking, how will we know which schools will accept more students for 2022? Like, like there's some schools that accepted more this year. Is that going to happen next year? Have you seen that happen in the past? Is this an anomaly?
I mean, generally they're going to be staying around the same. I'd say Rice is definitely, they've announced they're accepting 20% more students. They're increasing their enrollment this year. But I'd say generally the amount that they accept is around the same. I mean, yeah, because unless they're building dorms, some schools do gradually grow, but it's never like really drastic increases. Like Rice is a very rare exception. Not many schools increase their enrollment by 20% each year.
A question about how does a student decide whether it is best, like to attend in a test course? So they might have taken a test score, and then how do they decide on each individual school whether or not they should be submitting the test score or not?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that you'll hear me say a lot, especially if you join the concierge service, is it depends. So I think it depends on what the score is, the size of the school, the selectivity of the school. So obviously, if a school is smaller, then you're going to want to be, and they're smaller and they're really selective, then you're going to want to be at the top of their mid 50% test range or above. Because so colleges, for those of you who don't know, report the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile of enrolled students to their freshman class each year. And so you can kind of see where your test scores fall within that. And so if it's a smaller school, you definitely want to be more towards the top of that. If it's a larger school, they have more spaces available. So they could be a little bit more flexible if you have other more redeeming qualities to your application. Or let's say your grades and your rigor of curriculum are strong. But I'd say the smaller the school and the more selective, the more you want to be at the top or above that range.
So there's a similar kind of question to
Yeah.
that about if a student has a test score that's in this 25th percentile, does that mean they shouldn't be applying at all?
Well, I mean, I would say apply test optional in that case.
Right. But even
Yeah.
should they even consider applying test optional?
Well, I think it depends on it depends on the student. So there's where you get that false sense of admissibility. So if you're a 25th percentile student, but you're generally not so for a highly selective school, let's say, and you're 25th percentile student, now keep in mind 25% or fewer, 25% or students or less have that test score, but those might be legacies, those might be full pay, high donors, those might be recruited athletes that are in that are in that bottom 25%. But you could be genuinely a bad test taker, but somebody who gets all A's, works really hard, participates in class, is president of their student council, is in honors and AP classes or IB classes, and in that case you might be a really good applicant. So I would say if you are not, don't apply to a top tier school, test optional, if you're not somebody who is taking lots of honors and AP classes and is getting A's, essentially. That's where I saw I saw students say, oh, well, I just want to give it a try. And
again, to go back to your other comment, they could give it a try if they had those two fallback schools.
Yes, but I would say also, because I have had that, I had a discussion with a student the other day who had like 30 schools that she was considering, and was a late bloomer student, but even as a junior is like a 3.5 GPA, which is an improvement over below a 3.0, but still a 3.5 GPA is not going to get you in to those Ivy League schools. And so I just said it's not worth the time applying because they all have a lot of essays, and I'd rather see her bring her grades up and actually have a better chance at getting into the reach schools that are within reach instead of the reach schools that are out of reach. So I think you need to be realistic with yourself as to is test optional giving you a false sense of admissibility?
So one last quick question, and then I'm going to explain what the concierge service is, because I'm actually getting a lot of questions about what it is. So talk a little bit about majors, are some majors more competitive at schools?
Actually,
and we had a whole session on this.
That was
a whole session. Yeah,
that was this past month's workshop.
actually.
So I did a whole workshop on that. So it depends. Generally, you're going to find that nursing is very competitive. You're going to find that like fine and performing arts are competitive. Engineering tends to be competitive, but within engineering, computer science is the most competitive. And then mechanical engineering is the least competitive. So it just depends on the discipline. But I'd say those are the most competitive majors generally, and there's reasons for them. And if you join the concierge service, you can see the workshop that talks more in detail about them. And then I go into the differences between colleges and universities. And so I'd say at universities, your major matters more than at liberal arts colleges. They're generally just accepting students into the college because most people change majors or take double majors or things like that anyway.
And one last question, because it's related.
Okay.
Somebody's asking, is FISC a good resource that would
I
help
love-
you to say what are the good majors at certain colleges?
Yes.
It is,
Yeah. That's one of the resources that I use. I use a number of resources, but that is one, and I like it. And FISC has an online guide as well. So I love their online guide. Great descriptions of the schools.
Okay, so for those of you who are asking, so the concierge service is actually kind of similar to what we did tonight. You know, we have specific topics. We go in depth on them. As you can see, Rebecca loves data. I love data. If there's data available on a topic, we will try and get our hands on it. Just to kind of substantiate or back up, you know, whatever the recommendation is that, you know, Rebecca's providing. But we have a schedule of topics related to where people should be in the year on what they should be working on. We have a monthly coaching session just like this, and you know, people can ask questions, mute themselves. We have office hours once a month too, that you can come back, ask questions on the topic, ask questions about anything else that might be going on. And in addition, you can send in 3 emails. So that might be related to your personal situation, which is completely understandable. Somebody might not want to share it in a larger group or even in an office hour. So we give you the option to send in, you know, your specific question. And so there's a lot of ways that you can get information and then get your questions answered. And that's really like a big deal, that we want to provide, you know, an outlet for you to get your questions answered, because we can provide a lot of good information. But at the end of the day, when you internalize the information, you know, you always sometimes come up with your specific question, you know, so so making sure that you can get it answered is a really important thing that we focus on. So that's one thing. The second thing is we have a tool called College Insights, which is a search tool. You know, Rebecca talks about all the data that she gathers. This actually has a lot of all that data in one place, gives you the chance to search and filter, sort and compare. We also have crowdsourced information in that tool. So that's part of the concierge service. And then we're also partnering with a company called Prompt to help people handle all of their essays. So we're going to do sessions on essays, but then if you want if you want your students' essays reviewed, then we're partnering with Prompt to have that work done with their essay specialists. And we've partnered with them a few years ago, and we're repartnering with them. And if you're not familiar, they're a great service. So the session that we're opening up is going to go from beginning of June to the end of September. We're actually going to have another session after that if people want to re-enroll, but it's only going to be for the people who are in the concierge. And this session, this June to the end of September, is personally, I think it's critical. If you as a family want to make sure you're getting through the admissions process, you have to take advantage of the summer. I know that, you know, people want to relax. You know, the school counselors may not be available at school, but it is critical to really get your hands around your college admissions process over the summer, because come September, it's just and your student, you know, is going to start schoolwork, and hopefully, you know, they'll be a little bit more back to normal in their regular school, and they're going to want to do activities and all that type of stuff. And they're, quite honestly, they and you are going to get slammed, you know, trying to do all this work if you wait and start this in September. So summer is ideal, and we want to help you, and we want to help you kind of get it done from beginning of June to the end of September. And during that time, you should be able to build your list, have a really good balanced list, and absolutely get the common essay done, and at least the start of some supplemental essays. And so that's really the focus of this next session. and hopefully you guys will be interested in joining us. And as I mentioned, if you sign up by May 23rd, you'll also get this great book, The Price You Pay for College, and be invited to the Q&A with the author,
Interesting.
Ron.
You did another, yeah, oh, sorry. I didn't see the
here
other
they
slide.
are. Yeah. Here's everything I just explained: the coaching sessions, college insights, office hours, 3 free emails. If you still want one-on-one help, you can get it, and you can get that at a discount. You know, and I actually have to say, and this community, you know, it's great. I know a lot of you are part of the Paying for College 101 group, and I appreciate that, and I'm sure you get a lot of value out of it. But it's also really nice to be part of a smaller community of parents who are, you know, have a rising senior and are going through it. And as I mentioned, that's what I kind of just finished up with the class of 2021. And it's nice to see, like, over the year that they really, you know, get like tighter, and you get to know what somebody else's family is doing and what their students are looking for. It's just a nice feeling that you're part of a smaller community. One woman actually even referenced it. It was like when her son was born, and she was part of some actually online community then, and they still get together to kind of like touch base and see where their kids are even all these years later. So that's the concierge service. Again, if anybody has any questions, reach out. Deadline May 23rd for the early bird, but June 2nd, that is the absolute last date. That's when we're closing. And hopefully we'll be able to help you guys out. In the meantime, you know, feel free to send questions my way. We still try and, you know, answer as many as we can. I think that's probably about it for tonight. I know that there's a ton of other questions. I'm going to look through them, and if I can summarize some of the questions, I will send them with answers in the follow-up email that we'll send out tomorrow.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Rebecca.
Have a good night.
Bye.